Hi, this is Jared. Assassin's Creed is a series with deep roots, going back a decade to the original game. Ubisoft took a year off to refine the series for this year's Origins, and while on the surface the engine is the same Anvil Next 2.0 used in Unity and Syndicate, there have been some notable updates. Specifically, Origins doesn't use any GameWorks technology, though as we'll see in a moment, the game continues to strongly favor NVIDIA GPUs. I've run tests on more than a dozen GPUs, including some old standbys, all using Intel's latest 8th gen i7-8700K processor. I've also tested the fastest graphics cards from AMD and NVIDIA on other CPUs, and Origins stands out as a game that can really push beyond the capabilities of quad-core processors. All testing for this video was done with the current 1.03 patch, which improved NVIDIA performance quite a bit, but didn't help AMD cards. Ubisoft says it's continuing to look into performance and optimizations for all hardware, so a future patch or drivers may improve AMD card results. 1080p medium is usually pretty tame in terms of hardware requirements, but in Assassin's Creed Origins it serves as a good stress test for the CPU and drivers. We have the GTX 1050 and 1063GB from NVIDIA, and the RX 564GB and 574GB from AMD. Normally these cards are a pretty close match, but in Origins the NVIDIA cards hold a commanding lead. I noticed low GPU utilization on AMD cards, in the range of 50 to 70% at times, indicating the graphics cards simply aren't getting fed data fast enough, something a driver update ought to be able to address. When we look at the full set of results, what immediately stands out is the lack of performance scaling on AMD's faster GPUs. None of the cards break 70 frames per second, and even dropping to lower quality settings doesn't help much. Even at the very low preset, the Vega 64 still only scored 71 frames per second. On a related note, the Intel HD 630 results are also taken using the very low preset, and even at 720p and minimum quality, Intel's graphics fail to come anywhere close to playable frame rates. At ultra high quality, Assassin's Creed becomes even more demanding. The 1070 still manages to break 60 frames per second, but that's the minimum you'll need to accomplish that feat. NVIDIA cards continue to dominate AMD offerings, and again, low GPU utilization on AMD hardware seems to be a major factor. The RX 580 isn't that far behind the Vega 56, both of which trail the GTX 1060 and 1070. You can improve performance by around 10 to 15% by dropping to high quality if you need to, but even dropping all the way to minimum quality only boosts frame rates by about 50% over maximum quality, unless you have a card that has less than 3GB VRAM, like the GTX 1050, in which case you shouldn't go above the high preset. 1440p will require even more potent hardware to come close to 60 frames per second. And yes, there's a very clear difference between 60 frames per second and 30 frames per second in Origins. Only the GTX 1080 and 1080 Ti get there, though overclocking the 1070 Ti and maybe the 1070 with a few tweaks to settings will get there as well. Interestingly, AMD's Vega cards start to gain on NVIDIA at 1440p, and GPU utilization also increases. Basically, drivers and CPU become less of a limiting factor as resolution increases. If you're sporting multiple graphics cards, you're unfortunately out of luck. Origins won't use more than a single GPU, at least not right now. Considering the CPU limits imposed by the engine, that's probably for the best, and this is one more major release in a growing list where SLI and Crossfire won't do you any good. 4K Ultra naturally breaks the will to survive for even the hardiest of current graphics cards. If you want to get 60 frames per second at 4K, your only real choice is going to be the 1080 Ti or Titan XP, and then you'll still need to use a combination of medium and high quality settings. Even the GTX 1080 at minimum quality only averages in the mid-50s at 4K. 4K is also the only place where the Vega cards can start to match NVIDIA's 1070 and 1070 Ti. Minimum frame rates are still quite a bit lower on the AMD cards, and there's a decent amount of microstutter present, but it shows that when the GPU cores are the major limitation, AMD's hardware holds up pretty well. Either the drivers or the game engine are holding the cards back at lower resolutions and settings right now. The primary CPU testing, and what I'll focus on here, is done with the GTX 1080 Ti. For the frame rate overlays, I focused on the more popular CPUs, which gives us a wide range of performance options. The 8700K is the fastest gaming CPU in nearly every game I've tested so far, which isn't too surprising. Ryzen 7 1800X by comparison falls well short of that mark, though it just edges out the new quad-core i3 8100. But what's really interesting is that Threadripper 1920X and 1950X actually show substantially better performance from the AMD processor side. The Threadripper chips are a solid 25% faster than the Ryzen 1800X. It could be that Origins throws around so many threads for AI and physics that Threadripper pulls ahead, or it might be the additional memory bandwidth offered by the platform. Either way, Threadripper owners can at least be happy about gaming performance for a change. While AMD's GPUs remain disappointing for now, Assassin's Creed Origins is a very demanding game that can tax even i7-7700K processors, and for higher quality settings at 1440p it will require a potent graphics card. That doesn't mean you can't enjoy the game on lesser hardware, but be aware that when Ubisoft speaks of minimum hardware requirements to run the game, it's talking about 30 frames per second, not 60 frames per second, and 720p at very low settings, not 1080p at medium quality. In my testing, for 1080p medium at 30 frames per second, you'll want at least a GTX 1050. A GTX 660 might be sufficient to get minimum quality 720p at 30 frames per second, but you're really scraping the bottom of the barrel. For AMD, you'll need an RX 560 or R9 380 for 1080p medium, while older generation R9 270 or even an HD 7870 should manage maybe 720p very low at 30 frames per second. Thanks to MSI for providing us with all of the test hardware for these performance analysis articles. Given the CPU limitations encountered with Assassin's Creed, I felt it was a good time to move over to Z370 and Coffee Lake for the primary test results this time, using the MSI Z370 Gaming Pro Carbon AC motherboard. That also allowed me to use DDR4 3200 CL14 memory, which further improves performance. For additional testing results, as well as commentary and details on which settings can cause the largest change in performance, check out our full article on PCGamer.com.